and the richness of the Psalms that's there. Does that make sense? Now, something hit me in prayer the other day, not that I feel like I never want to sleep. I just want to keep moving. Is I thought we've had so much heaviness. I thought maybe in the summer we might do just a fun course on like Catholicism in movies. So like, for example, The Wizard of Oz or Shawshank Redemption, and just look at the movie, real short sessions, and just say, let's look at some Catholic themes in here and what we can see. Does that make any sense? That's more of a fun course. So that's more of a kind of a neat thing that we would do. So I was thinking about Catholicism in movies, just to lighten the mood a little bit. Okay? And then we'll do puppies and dogs and which ones are the most likely in heaven. Atomic bomb, political, diplomatic lessons, human rights, ethical lessons, and then, of course, Catholic lessons. These again are online, so Andrie posted them last night for you. President Truman, as we looked at, with the grave concern as they're getting closer and closer to the island of Japan, and they've had some brutal battles at Guadalcanal, Saipan, they've had Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and so they're going, oh my gosh, we've lost a lot of guys, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of trauma. What in the world is this going to look like in Operation Downfall? That's going to cost, could be thousands, millions. I mean, the numbers are all over the place. We have no idea, hypothetically, how many American and Japanese lives would be lost. Military leadership is determined. We saw this Bushido sort of mentality, this samurai code, which is fight to death, the glorification of death over surrender, defend the country and the emperor at all costs. There we saw many times very few Japanese prisoners surrendering or being taken alive. So you can only imagine what this would have looked like had our troops gone ashore here and what this would have looked like. Well, only God would know that particular answer. So what is going to take to break their resolve, to break their will to surrender? President Truman then makes this decision. There's been books written about this, courses about this, to use atomic bombs. You know that, of course, there was 3 of them. One of them was tested. Remember where it was tested? Is it New Mexico? In New Mexico, they tested it to see what is going to be the sort of the scope of this thing, and it's the first time an atomic bomb is used. And then they make the decision to bomb the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. The objective here is the unconditional surrender of Japan and to end the war as quickly as possible and avoid as much death and carnage and suffering as possible. So just a couple overview slides for you on the atomic bomb here. The projected casualties of invasion are kind of all over the board, but we do know there probably would have been hundreds of thousands of our American troops would have lost their lives. This doesn't even mention how many millions of Japanese would have lost their lives, military as well as civilian deaths as well. We want Truman as advisors hope the immense shock value of the new weapon would convince Japanese leaders to surrender immediately, a goal that traditional bombing and naval blockade had not yet achieved at that particular time. Remember, we talked about the firebombing, which itself was pretty catastrophic, of thousands and thousands and thousands of deaths. Lack of alternatives. There was a high-level advisory group called the Interim Committee, the scientists and government officials that recommended using the bomb against Japan without any warning, after concluding that no demonstration on an unpopulated area would be convincing enough to get them to surrender. In other words, the idea was, why don't you just drop the bomb like right over here? They see that and go, oh my gosh, we don't want that, so let's just surrender. They said, that mentality, that won't work. That was their conclusion on that. That is not going to work. Political considerations, there are some. The United States, some post-war geopolitical considerations in the United States, and some are arguing that they wanted to demonstrate their military power, right, to the world. We can already smell, as Dr. Werner was saying, that there's kind of a tension here between East and West with us and the USSR and the Soviet influence in Asia. So let's show them that, look, we are not weak, we are strong, right? So don't mess with us, type of thing. You can feel the kind of the coldness in some sense already with these Yalta Conference and Potsdam conferences. You can already feel the tension between these two countries. Political opinion at this time. The American public is weary of a long war. We've already lost a lot of our boys. There's anger, still resentment from Pearl Harbor and the Japanese atrocities, largely supported the use of the bomb to achieve total victory and unconditional surrender. By the way, there was a stat I just saw. It was like right after the war, they asked, was that a good thing or not a good thing to use the bomb? It was like 80+% of the American public said it was a good thing, really good thing. That number has dropped significantly, right, today. It's 50 to 60% now. It's interesting how time shifts perspectives and how different generations view different things, if that makes any sense. So that has dropped quite a bit, right, over time. The decision to use one of the most debated and controversial in all of history, opponents questioning whether the bomb was necessary, and supporters arguing there's the only viable way to end the war. And we're going to look at both sides of the debate in just a moment. So just some of the facts. So August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. I've seen some footage of this. They showed like the city just before it got hit. This bomb called Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. It killed, estimated now, 70,000 to 80,000 people instantaneously, just vaporized and gone. Developed as part of the Manhattan Project, but that was like $2 billion, Dr. Tod? It was like a $2 billion investment in this. That's a lot of money at that time. This gun, it was delivered by the B-2 bomber, Enola Gay. It was Tibbets that dropped that, detonated with a force of about 15 kilotons of TNT. The total death toll was injuries and radiation effects surpassed 100,000 on that first bomb. It's kind of a famous picture here. Look at the carnage of that. Just takes a moment just to kind of soak that in. War is hell. It's ugly. The second atomic bomb is nicknamed Fat Man. You know these names they give these bombs, right? I don't know where they come up with these names. Was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, Japan, 3 days later, August 9th at 11:02 a.m. It was a plutonium-based implosion. This is even a bigger explosion here. 21 kilotons on this one. Also deployed by the B-29 bomber Boxcar. Nagasaki was a second target after the primary target, Kokura, was obscured by clouds, leading to widespread devastation and contributing to Japan's unconditional surrender later that month. This bomb was more complex than the first one. This weighed nearly 10,000 pounds, 4.5 tons, an explosive yield coefficient of 21, as I mentioned before, more powerful than the first bomb. 40,000 people were killed instantaneously in this one, and then after the injuries and radiation, it reached over 70,000 people in Nagasaki. Reasons for the bomb, as mentioned, we've mentioned how many times already. Military planners anticipated a land invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, will result in hundreds of thousands of American deaths and millions of Japanese casualties due to the fierce Japanese resistance, which included the mobilization of civilians. The United States wanted to avoid what's called an Okinawa from one end of Japan to another. They had just experienced the horrific carnage of Okinawa, including the civilians, and they thought, we don't want this for the entire country of Japan. Additionally, Japan's military government was deadlocked and refused to accept the Allies' demand for unconditional surrender. It was outlined in the Potsdam Declaration, which was in July 28th, where the Allies came together and said, okay, here are our demands on Japan. One of those was unconditional surrender. They wanted to preserve their government, they wanted to preserve their military structure, and they also wanted to preserve their emperor, Hirohito. The shock of the new weapons was intended to break the political stalemate and force an immediate acceptance of our terms upon your country. We also want to end the war. Everybody's tired of fighting. The war in Europe had ended in May 1945, but fighting had continued in June and July and in August in the Pacific. U.S. leaders wanted to end this war as quickly as possible to prevent any further loss of life and ongoing conventional bombing. They were arguing, and naval blockade were not working to the effect that they wanted it to, right? They were saying, this is not breaking their resolve, so we need to do something else. Additionally, as I mentioned, a significant, though often debated, factor was the desire to display the immense power of the new weapon to the Soviet Union, the emerging Cold War rival. Using the bomb served as a warning to deter Soviet expansion in the post-war world and give the United States diplomatic leverage in this particular conflict that's coming. As I mentioned, this is a very expensive project, $2 billion, a massive sum at the time, and therefore there was internal and political pressure to demonstrate the value of this massive investment. I think that's the weakest of all the arguments. Just because you spend a lot of money doesn't justify killing a whole bunch of people. I mean, that's ridiculous. The atomic bombings were the least bad option. That's a common argument. The least bad option that ultimately saved lives on both sides by preventing a brutal and prolonged invasion. The other side of the debate against the bomb, the bombings resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent people. Civilians is the number one argument against the bomb, including women, children, and families who are not combatants. They're just families. They're just people like you and me, raising profound ethical questions about targeting non-combatants in a war and violating humanitarian norms. Now, just to note that it is intrinsically evil. It means it's wrong, always and everywhere, to kill an innocent human being. It's wrong. As the act is seen as inherently wrong, regardless of your intentions or your circumstances, the benefits that you get out of it. The good action itself is never justifiable, and good intentions or beneficial outcomes can't make a morally bad act good. Remember, we talked right away in the course of utilitarian arguments, right? Which is, I base the morality of a decision or an act on the consequences that come out of it. That's one prong. You also look at intention, and you have to look at what's the object of the act that you're actually doing. What are you doing? What is it you're actually doing? So all three of those have to be looked at. Those who argue against the bomb also argue that Japanese was already clearly on the decline and basically on the verge of defeat. This is their argument. Many historians and some military leaders, William Leahy and Eisenhower as well, argued that Japan was militarily defeated and the use of the bombs is just simply unnecessary to win the war. They believe that naval blockade and continued conventional bombing would have finally broken them and caused them to surrender, forced them to surrender. Debatable, right? That's all hypothetical. We don't know. So if you're not going to use the bomb, then you need to come with some alternatives. What can you do? You could modify the unconditional surrender and say, we're not going to demand you to unconditionally surrender. That means you have to do every single thing we say no matter what. You could have allowed Japan to retain their emperor, Hirohito. And by the way, that was their biggest thing, was they saw him as a divine figure, and he's the embodiment of the whole country. And so we want to protect our emperor, right, at all costs. So you can't make demands on us that tell us what to do with our emperor. So they just refused to kind of put their emperor into our hands, into our decisions. And so there's many who argue to say, why are you forcing them to unconditionally surrender? Say, we want you to surrender, there'll be negotiations, we're going to stop fighting, and this is what we're going to do. So this was a big sticking point for the Japanese to say, we don't want to unconditionally surrender. You can't tell us what to do everything. I'm sorry, it's not how it works. And we're saying, yes, you are going to do what we tell you to do. Waiting for the Soviet Union, they were on their way to enter the war against Japan. They attacked Manchuria. Remember, that's where Japan attacked that northeastern China in 1931, an event that many analysts believe would have been the decisive shock and needed for surrender. Like, now you got both sides with a kind of vice grip with the United States and the Soviet Union coming from the east and then from the west. Or some argued against that advisory council that a demonstration of the bomb on an unpopulated area to showcase its destructive power without mass casualties maybe would have got them to surrender by seeing that. Some argue that bombs were used to primarily to demonstrate, again, the power for Soviet Union, so there was other alternatives or reasons by why we use this. Additionally, some argue that, look, you dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki 3 days after Hiroshima, so you didn't give them enough time to even surrender basically and think about it and talk about it, so you just kind of wham bam on them right after. That's kind of unethical. Anscombe is the article you had. She contends that it is always wrong to intentionally kill innocent civilians, a principle she felt was violated by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. She argued that the ends ending the war did not justify the means of murdering innocent people, contra utilitarianism. So I'm just giving you both sides of the argument. I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other, but anybody who says I have a slam dunk argument, I disagree with you. There are pretty good reasons on both sides that are there, but there's significant problems with killing innocent people. There just is. We benefited from it without question, but it's interesting how even opinion is changing about that particular thing over time. So, ending the war, Allied powers issued an ultimatum July 20th, 1945, demanding that unconditional surrender of the Japanese armed forces. We then, of course, bombed them on August 6th, August 9th. Soviets declare war on Japan on August 8th and invade the Japanese-occupied Manchuria the very next day. So it's not looking good for Japan. Look at that kind of cool picture there, the USS Missouri. The Emperor Hirohito on August 15th, this would be the Feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, announces the surrender to the Japanese people in a radio broadcast known as the Jewel Voice broadcast. This is a really big deal because they rarely heard the voice of their emperor, right? And there's lots of tears and crying when this was kind of broadcast over their country. The formal signing of the instrument of surrender took place on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The ceremony officially marked the end of World War II. And then you had their foreign minister, their general, sign the document on behalf of Japan, and Douglas MacArthur was our representative for the Allied powers. This is, you can see this, they have videotape of this. It's just this huge, very ceremonial thing, and it's iconic. You have guys hanging off the side, you have this table that's there. It's just something to watch this. I've actually watched this before. And the representative from Japan comes with a top hat on, and he comes in it's just immaculate suit. And then you have, MacArthur on our side, right? So it's just, and they're all just sort of watching this as they're signing these particular documents to end the Second World War. And some newspapers there. Of course, everybody is very thankful and excited that the war has ended. And there's when Germany had surrendered. To me, that looks like a priest there, huh? And a Catholic, he's very excited. So, as the doc mentioned, we had VE Day on May 8th. Millions pour into the streets across Europe and the United States to dance, to sing, to rejoice. Major events included crowds in London and New York Times Square, as lots of jubilation and excitement. You probably have parents have talked about this particular moment in our history. And then VJ Day, for us it's August 14th, right? So Japan, he's on 15th, but we have the day difference. And September 2nd is the signing of the documents on the USS Missouri. Widespread celebrations included public gatherings, street parties, and other forms of rejoicing. Just thankfulness that the war has come to an end. Have you seen this photo before? So Alfred Eisenstein snapped this iconic photo of a U.S. Navy sailor kissing a woman in a white. We've always thought she was dressed like a nurse, but apparently she was a dental assistant. And amid the jubilant crowds in Times Square to celebrate the end of World War II. This photo was published in Life magazine and became kind of a symbol of victory and the end of the war. We certainly owe an extraordinary debt of gratitude to our military soldiers who served in the war for us, especially those who made the ultimate sacrifice of giving their lives, as well as civilians who contributed through their prayers, rationing, working in war industries of that nature. It affected us all. We're very grateful for them. It's got a couple iconic photos for you here of gratitude and victory. We owe our World War II veterans and all our veterans a debt we can never fully repay. Some lessons for you, and you probably have some things you can take away too. Political and diplomatic. I think one thing is to have vigilance, especially as a citizen, against extremism. I am concerned about the extremism that we're seeing. I don't care if it's left or right. I don't like extremism. The only thing I like to be extreme in is in love and self-sacrifice, like St. Paul says. Other than that, there's something about kind of rationality and moderation and being able to talk things through. But when you start to shift this way or this way, that's really dangerous, really dangerous. It starts to move into emotion and irrationality at that point. World War II is a great reminder that political systems can descend into extremism and atrocities. And what's scary is when times get tough, like a crash in 1929, these things tend to be like viruses or bacteria that begin to flourish. So you have to be very vigilant when times are tough, and people make all kinds of false promises to us. Citizens should be vigilant and not become complacent. You should raise your voice. Additionally, confronting aggression, the failure of appeasement, and now I know that was the kind of protocol at the time, but appeasing an aggressor over and over again, like an alligator eventually is going to eat you, can be more dangerous in the long run, and that democracies must be prepared to resist aggression when it first appears. We talked about that. We also saw the dangers of isolationism, the United States stance for a while. The war demonstrated that you can't just be a country on your own apart from the rest of the world. It allows very bad things to happen in other parts of the world. We also looked at the impact of ideology, which is a kind of cancer of the mind or a kind of cancer of the soul. I think the World War II underscores how extreme ideologies, communism, Nazism, this kind of militaristic samurai code, they then can lead to unprecedented atrocities like the Holocaust, and how a nation of a cultured nation like Germany can be transformed into one of great barbarity. That's there. We saw how ideologies such as fascism and communism were kind of cancer of the mind or a virus of the soul. They rejected evidence that conflicted with their worldview, and they leveraged emotions. We saw how they used emotions and not rationality, such as fear and anger, with the goal of creating a strong sense of identity, belonging, and a promised utopia, this kind of messianic dream, this kind of Aryan sort of thing that they had. The omelet that we're going to have, or the messianic sort of peace that we're going to have, and that justifies all the evil actions that we're doing. This kind of time of happiness and prosperity that will result. Ideologies have significant consequences, as we saw that millions of people died from them. I was watching a while ago, it was the director of that World at War series, and he kind of gave his sort of spiel on his lessons that he learned from World War II. And he said one of the lessons we learned is we did all these interviews with these different people. And a lot of these places, like, in the communist regime and the Bolshevism, many times the people would say, yeah, I mean, we kind of knew what we were doing was wrong, but I got a family, right? I got a food. I mean, I got to just sort of get along here, right? I mean, give me a break. Don't be too harsh on me. Like, what would you do? He said, but when we interviewed the Nazis and we asked them, they responded very differently. They never said, yeah, we knew what we were doing was wrong. They didn't say that. They said, you have to understand. We thought what we were doing was right. We were the good guys. You were the bad guys. And so he said that what they told us was that the ideology, the propaganda, the brainwashing went far, 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 far deeper. in the Nazi regime than it did others. It just kind of took up the whole soul and the whole mind. They literally thought they were the good guys and we were the bad guys. That's dangerous stuff when the mind gets that kind of wrapped around that kind of stuff. So ideology is real and it's out there. We looked at propaganda and communication. World War II showed the effectiveness of political propaganda, how it shapes public opinion and influences attitudes towards the war effort. We also saw how peace is fragile. It is a gift from God, and you have to work at it. It's not just going to happen, you know? They say if you want peace, work for justice. The conflict's massive human costs and rapid descent of nations into conflict highlight how fragile peace can be and should never be taken for granted. We also looked at the human capacity for both evil and good. This idea that people are just generally good, I don't agree with that. You're created good, but we have a free will, and we have a fallen human nature, and we have a capacity for great evil as well. And World War II shows this. The war exposed the boundless potential for both savagery, the Holocaust, the Bataan March, fire bombings, and extraordinary acts of heroism and courage and resilience. Ordinary people were forced into very, very difficult choices and impossible ones, revealing the complexities of human nature under extreme duress. And as the doc kept saying, World War II is a study of human nature, right? How we act, right? And sometimes I say to myself, how would I act? I have no idea how I would act. I don't know, right? I just have to say, Lord, help me with whatever comes my way, right? That's there. Again, power of propaganda. We saw how scapegoating can be a very dangerous thing. When you take an entire race of people and you scapegoat them, you're the reason for all of our problems, and we're going to lay upon you the burdens of our country and not take any responsibility for our own sins. We also looked at how we have to discern fact from propaganda and be skeptical in some sense of those in power, because, you know, we want them to do good, but power can corrupt us. We also looked at, I think also the Nuremberg trials, the trials, we didn't talk about this too much, but after the war, some people were tried, right? Established the principle that individuals can be held accountable in war for crimes against humanity, and that there's no honor in following dishonorable orders. We've talked about even in war, there's rules, right? You can't just kill somebody waving a white flag or kill women and children. There's still rules or a scaffolding that goes around war. That doesn't just go all out the window, right? And you can be tried for these things even during war, or war crimes. The atrocities committed during the war, particularly the Holocaust and involuntary medical experience, made it clear that there should be a kind of a global standard for just the basic human rights that we need as human beings. Catholic lessons. The war highlighted the fundamental Catholic teaching that really the human race shares a kind of common origin and an equal nature, creating the image and likeness of God. So even though we might look different on the outside, have different ethnicities and backgrounds and different countries and cultures, it's all created by our loving Father that's for us, and we're all potentially redeemable in Christ. As Benedict would say, we're all created from the same soil, right, in Genesis. There isn't some better soils and worse soils, top soil and bad soil. There's created from a certain soils. We're all created that image and likeness of God. I think Nazis' racial theories and euthanasia programs are seen as antithetical to our Catholic faith, and the Church's resistance to these ideas emphasize the sanctity of every human life, regardless of race or ability. And this is why the Church is so emphatic about the pro-life stance and against euthanasia and against killing people that have Down syndrome or disabilities, because that is a kind of Nazi mentality that says you only have value if you're productive or if you are utility. And so the Church has, that's not the Catholic belief. That is not reasonable at all. So the Church will continue to do that. We see as God is being eclipsed in our society more and more offenses against human dignity. And usually it's the weak and the vulnerable who get hit first. Little children in the womb. We're even seeing instances of infanticide now. And our elderly and need to be taken care of by doctors instead of being killed by them. So we're seeing all kinds of offenses against human dignity. Additionally, from a Catholic perspective, Catholics learn that the grave dangers of political ideologies, Nazism and fascism, that seek to supplant God and place the state, to make the state a god, race a god, or a people at an idolatrous level. The conflict underscored the reality of the ongoing conflict between good and evil, and the need for constant vigilance against ideologies that destroy human agency and religious freedom. We didn't talk too much about the just war doctrine. So in Catholic theology, we have a kind of doctrine around war. And when you go to war, that really reaffirm the Catholic just war tradition, which outlines a kind of criteria that need to be met before a nation attacks another country. Self-defense is kind of a last resort. I just kind of put those conditions: a last resort, it has to be a just cause, a valid authority needs to do it, what's the probable success, the force that you use can't be more than the good that would come out of it, and then you have to have kind of a strategy of how to end this particular thing. So there's all kinds of classes and articles around just war theory and Catholic just war theory. We also saw some beautiful heroic examples, both clergy and laity, of saving lives for others and the primacy of love. We saw how many times ordinary people went to extraordinary measures to take care of Jewish people and those who are vulnerable by hiding them, providing false documentation, or establishing escape lines. We saw two wonderful saints, Maximilian Kolbe and St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross, that self-sacrificial love reveals the primacy of God's love and unleashes that love into the world, even in the midst of great darkness, like a concentration camp. We also saw that being neutral can be complex, right? And you can take a lot of flack for that. The Vatican's official neutrality aimed at preserving the institutional church and its ability to provide pastoral care is a subject of fierce debate today. Pope Pius XII in his strategy revealed that there is a tension between pragmatic diplomacy and the need for a clear public moral voice against grave injustices. So this poor man has to sort of weigh these two things, of having a church and, and a public voice that cries out against justice. So these are not easy things to work through. We also saw that from a lot of this violence, we saw many saints, many of our soldiers, many of our civilians, that the glory and splendor of God in the midst of great violence and hate. Only from all eternity, for all eternity, we'll be unpacking all these little stories that happen in the midst of the war. We also saw, this is probably the biggest one for me, is what happens when we take the Lord out of our lives, out of our cultures, and out of our societies. What you end up doing is you take the chessboard and you take it out, and now we have no rules. In some sense, anything goes. Priests who served during the war observed that it was firsthand lesson in what happens when God is removed from life, strengthening their own determination to make God supreme in their lives and to take God to others. They said, this is what it looks like. This is a living hell without our Lord in our life. I thought, some of these pictures, look at that tiny little organ that guy's playing, and this guy's celebrating Mass here in the midst of the fields with these troops here. We also saw World War II reminds us that a world without God, a Japanese mentality, or a world that rejects God, the Nazis or communists, leads to suppression of individual conscience and grave offenses against human dignity, such as the Holocaust. We also again saw ideology as a cancer. World War II reveals how ideology can infiltrate everyday thought and language through propaganda, spreading hatred and justifying evil actions to ordinary people. I just wanted to find just kind of a neat slide in some sense from a Catholic perspective of this beautiful priest in the field giving Holy Communion to the troops. as they're kneeling there, so they're in some sense of being spiritually nourished in how they need the Lord. Last slide for you. Just grateful for your time in the midst of your busy schedule to participate in this course. And we hope we found it beneficial. Our hope is that our good Lord has touched you deeply, that your hearts have been strengthened in God's providential care. The daily sacrifices that you make will contribute to God's kingdom, and that as the Lord moves you along the path of becoming a joyful saint for our Lord Jesus and for him in all eternity, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to stop here for a good 10 minutes. Does that sound okay? So I went, not too bad, 45 minutes? Is that what it was? Okay, so we'll give you 10, 15 minutes, and then Dr. Tod will get up and give his spiel, okay? Sound good? Okay.
Okay, can everybody hear me? All right, I think we're gonna move on forward. What a great summary, obviously, from Father. For him to be able to distill the lessons the way he did, I think it's so important. And I think the entire genesis of why we decided to give this series of talks was to arrive at that point. This isn't just like an interesting History Channel conversation. It's a moral story. It's a narrative. It's a drama of human nature. And as Catholics, we say it's on the stage where the divine presence is still there, where God is present and evil is present as well, and this drama that unfolds. It's hard to consider anything in the modern era that rivals the Second World War. So for us to arrive at this day where we say, what are the lessons to learn? All I and Father can say is, you can read, you can do a deep dive on the Battle of Britain, you can do a deep dive on the Holocaust, you can do a deep dive on Stalin, on Kolbe and Edith Stein. It's limitless. But the moral and Catholic lessons they're overwhelmingly present. So I think both of us would say, Flannery O'Connor once said, I tell a story because a statement would be inadequate. If you want to evangelize the next generation, then tell them a story, and the story in the way that you identify, here's what happened, but here's where we see God in this story, and here's where we see evil. We see mankind run amok. Those stories are compelling. And that's one of the reasons why, I said this before, I think it's one of the reasons why Christ told so many parables, because love your neighbor as yourself is one way of saying it, but telling the story of the Good Samaritan is another. And it really kind of tweaks us to hear a story. This is a dramatic modern story. A couple things. I'm just going to give some quotes and then just reflect on them for a minute, and then we'll get into Q&A. So I'm not going to dominate your time. We really appreciate all the people who have come up to us before, during, and after this series, because you have amazing stories. And I say, please write them down, share them with me. Somebody just brought me some documents for me to look at today, which is fantastic. Years ago, when I was giving a talk on Truman about the atomic bomb, some guy just kind of sidled up to me during the break, and he said, I was on Guam during World War II, this kind of small island in the Pacific. And he said, my job was basically to inspect all the bombers that came through. I knew them from stem to stern. I knew every bolt, every rivet, hatches, et cetera. And he said there's one that came that had some oddity to its bomb hatch, and it was strange. And I didn't know what it was. It was like soldered shut, but they were going to be opening it up and doing things with it. And I went up to my sergeant and I said, something's different with this bomber, and I'm not sure what it is. And he said, don't worry about it. And he said, I always remember the name of that bomber, and it was the Enola Gay. So here he is inspecting the very bomber that's got the atomic bomb being loaded into it and being sent off to drop it. And that's a story that just comes up as an anecdote. And I'm just saying, if you think your parents or your siblings or your uncle's stories are sort of little interest to others, you are wrong. So preserve those stories, write those stories down, tell them to your kids, share those, because they're stories of great heroism. They're stories of incredible devotion to doing what is right, incredible tragedies and overcoming of tragedies. So please, thank you for sharing those stories. We're humbled by them. I said this earlier, and Father spoken on this so well. The World War II is a story of ideology and human nature. It is a story of worldviews that deviate from God, that want to become a secular religion in the place of God. And what I've tried to impress upon you in some of what I've said is, remember the divine narrative believes in three things among many, but if I could boil it down because I'm a simple person: dignified, fallible, redeemable. Dignified, fallible, redeemable. You are dignified because you are a child of God, ineradicably. You are not defined solely by your achievements, by your pedigree, by the money you have. You're dignified because you're a miracle, because Christ, God, the Trinity created you. Fallible. Yeah, you're dignified, but you're broken. That goes back to the fall. And with our brokenness comes sin, and comes mistakes and error, and terrible things can come out of that. But the good news is we're redeemable. And God is who redeems us. Christ on the cross, the corpus on the crucifix, signifies to us every day we look upon it that we are redeemable through his efforts and not through ours. And if you want to look at ideologies, fascism, communism, Japanese samurai culture, National Socialism, it's where one of those three parts of the narrative or all of them go awry. They get warped. Dignified. Well, the Nazis thought certain people were more dignified than others. If you're a white, Aryan, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Superman, you're super special. But if you're a Jew or a Gypsy or a Slav, you're not dignified. There's something that got warped. The communists, the collective, the proletariat are the special, uber dignified. It's the bourgeois and the kulaks and others, the capitalists, the religious, they are less than human in their respect. So you see where the narrative of dignified, as we see it as Catholics, goes awry in the eyes of ideologies. It gets warped. Fallibility, same thing. This gets warped when they either say you are so fallible you can never be retrieved, so you're worthless, or you're infallible. The right race, the right mindset about the economy and the collectivism and so on and so forth, that you're infallible. You can see, again, ideologies warp that. And then redeemable. You're not redeemable. If they say you're not redeemable, we move into nihilism. It's all meaningless. It just becomes will to power stuff. Or you're redeemable, but you're redeemable by our program, not by God. You're redeemable because the communist worldview is going to usher you into utopia. National Socialism is going to eradicate the Slavs and the Jews and make an Aryan super race in a Shangri-La of Russia. That's what's going to happen here. We need to be familiar with the Catholic narrative because it is the narrative. Dignified because you're a child of God. Fallible because of our forebears and the fall plus our own, but redeemable through the blood of Christ. That's the narrative. And anytime you see an ideology, say, where did they go wrong on any of these three or all three? Just got to pull up a couple notes here quick. I like to say, again, this is Eric Vogelin, was a thinker. He was actually a Jewish expatriate, came to the United States, taught at some universities. He had his famous line that William F. Buckley popularized in an off-the-cuff comment, one of his firing line shows. And he said, don't immanentize the eschaton. We love that because that's Buckley. What does that mean? Don't immanentize the eschaton. Immanentize, to render present now, to make imminent. The eschaton is paradise, the end of things. Communism, National Socialism, fascism, all said we can bring utopia here now. And at the end of the day, what's ironic, the greatest paradox is those who try to usher in a paradox, or try to usher in a utopia, lead to creating a hell on earth. Remember in the effort, this is, Lenin said you have to break eggs to make an omelet, and everybody later on said, but where's the omelet? All we have is broken eggs here. We have a lot of dead people, but we have no paradise. So we are not called to immanentize the eschaton. That is not our role. That's God's role, not ours. The second thing is, this is a paraphrase from Ivan of the brothers Karamazov. Ivan was the ivory tower, well-educated, sophisticated, condescending brother of the Karamazov family. He was an ardent atheist. And effectively what he said in his arguments, you should read the brothers Karamazov if you get the chance. It's a little heavy, but it's good. And one of the things effectively he says, and I'm paraphrasing it, is that if there is no God, anything is permitted. If there is no God, you have no right to be, if there is no God, there is no standard of justice, then the only thing that will determine the way things are going to be done is who has the power to do it. And nobody underneath that power has the flexibility or has the right to say that's wrong. You can, if there is no God and you don't believe in a notion of justice or a criterion of justice, you never can complain about getting cut off in traffic. Never. Because that person was better than you. That's all there is to it. That's all there's to, if you think about, if you're a moral relativist, at the end of the day, where there is no morals, there is no right and wrong, we're very enlightened, you should never get angry about getting cut off in traffic because everybody has the right to do whatever they want in that case. Chesterton, this is to the notion of dignity. Oh, I'm going to move, I promise I'll move on to it in a second. Thank you, you're eager for my slides, thank you. Chesterton said this: there will be Diocletian persecutions. There will be Dominican crusades. There will be the rending of all religious peace and compromise, or even the end of civilization and the world, before the Catholic Church will admit that one single moron or one single man is not worth saving. Now, moron was a term back then for feeble-minded, somebody who had, it's very impolitic to say that right now. But they describe people who were in the mental institutions, somebody who had intellectual or physical challenges. They called them a moron, right? Which is now a term of derision. But Chesterton's point was not just a moron, but he was saying when the Nazis when there was talk ideologically about the unfit, the lesser people that need to be eradicated, Chesterton said, there will be crusades. The church will go to the wall before we ever endorse this philosophy. And if you look at throughout history, and Father said it's complicated, but the long and the short is the church has been there and has been standing tall again and again and again in the face of ideologies after ideologies after ideologies. Finally, I want to say two things. Rene Girard is a Catholic philosopher, and he talked a lot about scapegoating. And he says there's a cycle for something called mimetic desire, mimetic rivalry, and scapegoating. Mimetic desire means that we oftentimes are drawn, we're very covetous. You know, you think about being jealous, being envious. In case you're wondering how much God thinks that we're covetous, he had to warn against coveting things twice in the 10 Commandments, right? Number 9 and number 10 are both dedicated to don't covet your neighbor's wife, and then don't covet all the other stuff. But I got to say it in 2 different commandments because you guys have a problem with this, all right? Mimetic desire means we oftentimes desire what other people have. And sometimes it's like, oh, I admire this. I'm going to work towards this and arrive at a better place. That's not a bad thing. But if I'm jealous and envious and I don't like that person for them, or I want them not to succeed, or I want them out of my way, that's a problem. You went from mimetic desire to mimetic rivalry. And this is such a pattern in our history, such a cycle, that oftentimes this mimetic desire spirals into mimetic rivalry and ultimately descends into scapegoating, where not only do I want what that person has, but I resent what that person has. Now I'm blaming that person for my woes because they have something I don't want. And the scapegoating ultimately leads to them being something as simple as a pariah to something like they're being incinerated in the Holocaust. And when that scapegoating happens, the cycle starts all over again. But what Rene Girard says very, very well, and others like Benedict XVI and other church fathers and so on have said again and again, Christ alone is the one that broke that cycle. Because he was fully innocent, fully divine, and he opened himself up to that sacrifice. He opened himself up willingly to be the scapegoat, to break the cycle of violence, and not say, bring down thunder and lightning on these people who are doing this to me, but saying, forgive them, they know not what they do. So to break that cycle, that's the thing about, how paradoxical it is in our faith to say, love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, not only that, but love your enemies, pray for enemies. If you hit in the cheek, turn the other cheek. If they take your tunic, give your other one. It's so contrary to the way of our fallible natures, and it's so godlike that it runs against our instincts. And that's why, as Chesterton said, we need a church that's right where we're wrong and not a church that's right where we're right. Our church corrects us on these things. So mimetic rivalry, mimetic desire, and scapegoating is a cycle you'll see again and again and again through wars and ideologies and so on. And I would just say keep an eye out for those things. Lastly, before I get into the slides, Father and I were talking about this. World War II is a war clearly defined by Mengele's, right? The angel of death, this doctor who was experimenting on kids. Horrible. But it's also defined by Kolbe's, the priest that raises his hand and says, I'll die for him. I will go in his place. And sometimes we read so much about the butchery and the horrors, which we need to be familiar with. But the real magic, the real inspiration are the martyrs and the saints and the dissidents and the soldiers that stepped off that Higgins boat, the pilots that navigated the airs over London against terrible odds to save the people they love below. Chesterton says, wars are fought not because soldiers hate what's in front of them, but because they love what's behind them, right? So we as Catholics have to say, when we stand up for what's right, it's not because we hate what's in front of us, it's because we love what's behind us. And we love what's in front of us. They're just wrong on this or that. All right. I modeled some of these comments based on the three things I said to the Edina. I don't see you guys as Edina High School students, okay? But every one of us has a little Edina High School student in us, right? When I give the talk about Churchill, I say there's three things I want you to walk away with. Know what the truth is, stand up for it, and when you get knocked down, get back up. If you want to know what the lesson of Churchill is, that's it. Know what the truth is, stand up for it, and when you get knocked down, get up. So we're going to just talk about a few quotes. I'm just giving you some quotes under these headings. Charlie Hill was a professor at Yale. He was a diplomat. He worked for George Shultz, Henry Kissinger. He worked in the United Nations, and he was brought in to give seminars to these Yale students who were international relations seniors at Yale. They're going to go and be ambassadors and State Department officials and so on. And he got there to teach them about some of the structures of the government internationally, and he went to the administration after talking to them, these students in a seminar, and said, they don't know anything. These kids are so ill-educated. It's frightening. And so he and a guy named John Lewis Gaddis and a guy named Paul Kennedy put together a class called Grand Strategy, which was a crash course on how the world works politically and diplomatically, but then scenarios where the students they called them murder boards, where they threw scenarios at these students who were in different roles, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Ambassador to China, whatever, where they had to react in real time and see, what do I do in the midst of all this? And Charlie Hill was interviewed, and he said, we have changed our education in the last 30 or 40 years so that students are really not being taught history. They're not being taught what it was that got us here. History gave way to being taught issues, and issues are something abstract. They're just out there. They somehow just show up. That is the fundamental reason why we have this seeming obliviousness or ignorance about the way the world has got to be managed in order to make everything else work well. If we don't know that, then it's all going to fall apart. And what I like to say to my students, my medical students and residents, is you can't just know the issues with your patients. You need to understand the context. How did they get here? Where are they now? Where will they go once you do X, Y, or Z? History is, remember Truman said, the only thing new in the world is the history you don't know. And if you know history, you start to understand cause and effect. And so it's important for us, but it's also important for us to impress upon our kids and our grandkids. You can't just know issues and think, oh, I got this. You have to understand context, which is a story and a narrative. Solzhenitsyn, again, he's more Cold War. You'll hear a lot about him next fall. But Solzhenitsyn was a dissident who went to the gulags for writing a letter critical of Stalin. He said, the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years. And even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. If you were a fan of great fiction, and I would say Shakespeare, Dickens, Austen, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, I mean, there's tons of others. But these writers in particular, they are so good because they show the varying shades of gray in every human being. That's not, well, this is the person with the white hat, they're the good guy. This is the person with the black hat, they're the bad guy. It's all interspersed in each one of us. It runs right through our human heart. That's the dignified, fallible, redeemable. It's the dignified and fallible. We walk being children of God that are broken. How do we make sure we attend to that part of us that is most godlike and try to seek reconciliation and serve penance for those parts of us that are wrong? The study of human nature is fascinating, as you all know. That's why you're here. This is all about human nature. But you have to understand your own as well. Physicist Richard Feynman said, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And Jacques Barzin, who lived to be 104 years old, he wrote a book called From Dawn to Decadence, 500 Years of Cultural History. It's terrific. He was at Columbia. Someone said to Jacques Barzin, well, man is a rational animal, and he stopped them short. He stopped them, he interrupted them, he said, capable of reason. There's a big distinction. Man is a rational animal. Nope. Man is capable of reason, which also means we're capable of unreason and irrationality. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he said, Macbeth's self-justifications were feeble. You all remember Macbeth? And Macbeth is the general who won these battles for King Duncan. He's Scottish, and he comes across the three witches that say, you will be king someday. And he's like, ha, 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 oh, you don't say. And he and Lady Macbeth start saying, let's go, let's make this happen. Come on, it's not happening fast enough. Well, why don't we kill people, including the king, and make it happen? And they descend into darkness, right? Macbeth's self-justification, Solzhenitsyn said, were feeble, and his conscience devoured him. Yes, even Iago. By the way, Iago, the most dark character in all Shakespearean lore. In Othello, there's very little redeeming quality in Iago. Almost every other Shakespearean character has some good in there somewhere. Iago, it's almost all just darkness. He said, even Iago is a little lamb too. The imagination and spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses. So in Macbeth, there were basically about 12 that got killed in this horrible situation, right? Ideology, that's what gives evil doing its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is the social theory which helps to make his acts seem good instead of bad in his own eyes and others' eyes. So he won't hear reproaches and curses, but will receive praises and honors. This is what Father was just talking about. The frightening thing is when the Nazis were like, we were right, actually. We were right. What you think is evil is our good. We were right. Solzhenitsyn was asked at one time, he asked himself for our benefit, why did Macbeth stop at 12, or it was 8, and Stalin didn't stop at a million? And he said, because Macbeth had no ideology. Stalin could kill millions because ideology gave him the excuse. It gave him the front. It gave him the programmatic algorithm to arrive at this certain place, and all these people need to die because we're going to arrive here. Whereas Macbeth had an appetite. He wanted power, but it stopped at one point or another. Flannery O'Connor says, the truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it emotionally. My dad, when I did something wrong and I was kind of justifying it, my dad would look at me and he says, the truth hurts. I'm like, oh, you're right. Churchill said, united wishes and goodwill cannot overcome brute facts. Truth is incontrovertible. Panic may resent it, ignorance may deride it, malice may distort it, but there it is. That's the thing about truth. It's a stubborn thing. It's a corrective and purifying thing. That's, like I said again, what Chesterton said. We don't need a church that's right where we're right. We need a church that's right where we're wrong, because it corrects us and it leads us to God. Solzhenitsyn again, he said, over a half century while I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of old people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that have befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. Now, forgive me, I know we're talking about Russia, but this applies to the Second World War. They said, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Since then, I've spent well nigh 50 years working on the history of our revolution. In the process, I've read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own toward the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were to ask today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Benedict XVI, one of the most famous homilies he gave was called The Dictatorship of Relativism. It was the homily he gave before they went into conclave and he was declared pope. And he said, as Joseph Ratzinger, he said, how many winds of doctrine have we known in recent decades? By the way, just so you know, Benedict XVI, obviously, he lived in Germany. He was conscripted into the Hitler Youth at the very last stages of World War II and escaped. And then obviously he was in Germany when the post-war situation was. He was very familiar with National Socialism and communism. And he says, how many winds of doctrine have we known in recent decades? How many ideological currents, how many ways of thinking? The small boat of the thought of many Christians has often been tossed about by these waves, flung from one extreme to another, from Marxism to liberalism, even libertinism, from collectivism to radical individualism, from atheism to a vague religious mysticism, from agnosticism to syncretism and so forth. Every day new sects spring up. And what St. Paul says about human deception and the trickery that strives to entice people into error comes true. But today, a clear faith based on the creed of the church is often labeled as fundamentalism, whereas relativism, that is letting oneself be tossed here and there, carried about by every wind of doctrine, seems the only attitude that can cope with modern times. We are building a dictatorship of relativism that does not recognize anything as definitive and whose ultimate goal consists solely of one's own ego and desires. And the one thing I want to say about this that I've sadly omitted, he goes on and he says, we search for the criterion that is God. We don't believe in all these different ideologies. We don't believe that there is no truth. There is no fundamental belief system. The belief system isn't a system at all. It's totality. It's God. He is our criterion. And he says, almost with an evangelical fervor, he says, what we seek is friendship with Christ. That's us. That's where the North Star is. All right, that was know what the truth is. Stand up. This is a great picture. Look at all these people doing the Sieg Heil salute, right? Look at that guy. Arms crossed. Don't even know who he is, but he wasn't having anything to do with it. Edmund Burke said, when bad men combine, the good must associate, else they will fall one by one in unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle. There's an apocryphal quote that is almost better, but he didn't necessarily say it. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Passivity is a sin of omission, but it becomes a sin of commission when we truly need to act and we're choosing actively to do nothing. Pastor Martin Niemöller was in the concentration camps, and he had once written, first they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And they came for the Jews. I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. We all know this guy? Right. A generation below me, they have no idea who Gregory Peck is. I'm like, are you kidding me? I've strived to be Gregory Peck my whole life. To Kill a Mockingbird. Courage is when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway and see it through no matter what. Right? We don't calculate when it comes to doing the right thing. We do the right thing. That's what we're called to do. John Shedd said, a ship in harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. I like a man who grins when he fights, says Winston Churchill. And John Paul II says, put out into the deep. We're not called to live tepid lives. We're called to be heroic in one way, shape, or form. You uniquely have a call to be heroic. The question is, how is God calling you? Finally, when knocked down, get back up. Everybody, I think, knows Theodore Roosevelt's man in the arena. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, but who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. I said this to my daughter recently. She had a rough test. And I said, the Chinese proverb, fall 7 times, stand up 8. Never give in. Never, 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 never. Churchill gave this speech at Harrow, his high school, where he did not do very well. He actually did very poorly. He was terrible at Latin. He said they wanted him to conjugate Latin lines, saying when you're addressing a table, you say, "O table," and you use this type of conjugation. He says, but I would never address a table. 0. Hilaire Belloc said, the church is a perpetually defeated thing that always outlives her conquerors. By the way, Belloc is a good friend of Chesterton's. Belloc was a salty, crude sometimes, bellowing person that debated George Bernard Shaw and Clarence Darrow and H.G. Wells, and they didn't like each other at the end of their debates. Chesterton was vast, portly, jolly, brilliant, but likable. All the people he debated, they liked each other. And Chesterton and Belloc were best of friends. But the thing about Belloc being kind of harsh and opinionated and brash When he put pen to paper, he's one of the greatest essayists of the 20th century. Beautiful, sublime writing. So if you get a chance to read Hilaire Belloc, he's a lesser-known name. You'll be blown away by what he writes. Churchill said, "We are all worms, but I do believe I am a glowworm." That's my last slide, and I just want to say we have to remember the narrative. Dignity, or dignified, fallible, redeemable. And it starts, we live in an age of identity. The identity politics, it's over the top. And the identity politics that are promoted out there are always fragments of what you are. Your sex, your race, your this, your that, all this kind of stuff. The totality of who we are in our identity is you are a child of God. If you remember that and you are dignified, you're ineradicably dignified, destined for greatness in the midst of the dark fallibility you have that requires the sacraments to nurture you. But if you remember that first part of the equation, you are a glowworm. You're not a worm. That changes everything. Thank you.
Testing. Okay, so we have about a half hour left. We don't have to go the entire time, but this is the time for you to, a little interaction if you'd like to, with either questions and comments. So the first one right here. Hey. It was in the 20s.
The late 20s, when Concordat,
So when was the Vatican formed? So the enclave there, the sort of a separate country, basically. It's its own sort of governance, administration, stuff like that. It was the 1920s. My understanding, the Concordat is they gave away a swath of land from Mussolini, and then they were able to have a little conclave there in Rome where, like, you're not part of our country in some sense, your own governance that's there. No, we talked about, this question is in terms of helping the Jews in a kind of secretive form using a network, the underground network of the church. There was certainly a coordinated effort behind the scenes. So it wasn't just some rogue priest doing his own thing. I mean, trust me, being a priest, we talk to each other behind the scenes a lot of what's happening, right? So there's a beautiful thing about the church. There's a kind of coordinated effort behind the scenes and getting lay folk involved as well. So there was a huge coordinated effort behind the scenes to save. I think there's a bunch in the Vatican, 200 Jews were being housed there, the documents being produced and stuff like that. So that's all the behind the scenes. Think of a play, behind the curtain, what's going on behind the curtain. A lot of that's being done to help out our Jewish brothers and sisters. Steve. The situation in Ukraine? Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Said, Doc, give a homily over there. I'm still stuck on pornography because I'm like, have I given that many homilies about pornography? There have been a couple in there. Did I say there was bad, right? I said it was bad, didn't I? Okay, that was good. Thank goodness. Yeah, it's a complex one, right? Because I personally, I'm aware of things happening, but I don't know the intricate details that are happening in Ukraine enough for me to speak sort of intelligently enough in a concise 8-minute package. But then the question I have is, what is the point of this? Like, what do I want my people to do or think? That's whenever I'm getting a homily, like, what's the point of this? Because if they come after me and say, nice, Father, what do you want me to do, man? Like, what's the point of that? So, like, somebody with a family or something like here, or a widow. So I also have to think of the ramifications is, what is the action sort of plan that you want them to do? Do you want them to write to their legislator? Do you want them to get on their knees and pray? Do you want them to get on a flight and go over there? What is it that you want them to do? Yeah, right. First of all, obviously, not to be pious, but how are your prayers for the people in Ukraine? What kind of sacrifices are you offering in Advent for them, right? Do you have any reaching out to any people that are here, Ukrainian refugees that are here, right? That are because of the war-torn country. There are some practical things that we can do, but I do have to take into consideration what do I want my people to do, right? With this particular message. Of course. Oh, it's the doc. Yeah, and the doc made a point is your own family members it's very close. It's right here, right? So the own blood is being poured out. My kids, right, are being my brother and stuff. So it's very personal when you're in 1945 and 1950, and these decisions have to be made. We're a little bit more removed from that now. Also, let's be honest, different generations just have different ways of thinking and mentalities, right? So sometimes you say, I don't understand that generation at all. I'm struggling with them. There's just, over time, generations tend to think differently, and there's time for reflection as well. Does that make any sense?
So there's something that C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery, where we think that since we're on the cutting edge of, here we are now in 2025, that means we're so much smarter than someone was in 2000, than someone was in 1975, someone was in 1950, and so on. So we kind of make judgments and look down on them and be like, well, look how enlightened it's a sanctimony. It's a little bit of a sanctimony. And I think Father, when he's showing the kind of the different sides about this, I struggle with the atomic bomb. I struggle with it. Because I was talking to somebody before we just talked here. It's hard because, you saw how the Japanese were fighting over rocks, and 5,000 die on one rock. What's it going to be like to go and invade Japan? and where people are innocent civilians today, but the next day they're coming at you with a pitchfork or whatever, and now they're combatants. And it doesn't mean that we don't need to take into consideration, just dropping the bombs and so on. But also the other thing is, every time we dropped a bomb, whether we were doing firestorms in Tokyo or Dresden or others, every time we dropped a bomb, any bomb, you killed innocent people, unless it was in an empty field. So one could get to the point of saying, well, you can never drop any bombs. Or what about shooting guns and you misfire and it goes through a house and it hits somebody and kills them? One could almost talk themselves all the way back into pacifism and saying, well, if there's a chance of one person dying, we can't do this. And that's not what the church is saying. And that's what gets into the just war theory and so on. I guess what I would say about chronological snobbery is I do think that all of us as Catholics, knowing we're fallible, dignified, fallible, redeemable, I think we have to basically come at these things with incredible gravity and incredible charity about what's at stake, and how the people that made the decisions then were contending with so much more than I could fundamentally even deal with now. And it's a little haughty and arrogant for me to just kind of but it doesn't mean we shouldn't wrestle with it and try to land as faithful as we can to where Christ wants us to go. So I just would say, for myself, I'm not saying this in a preachy way to you guys, but I have to be careful when I look at history of saying, well, that was ridiculous. Why did they do that? Or how could they think about that? That's chronological snobbery. It's sanctimony. And it's dismissive of things that somebody 50 years from now is going to look back at me and say, how could he think that way? Because there, but for the grace of God, go I.
Yeah, Renee. And it's the point I made earlier is obviously we're at a high level here. It's impossible for us to get into the weeds of the beautiful stories like that. And what we'll see, so in our Catholic theology, is that when you die, you have your particular judgment, which is your life is reviewed, or you see your life before you as God sees it, and you see yourself. And then we also have what's called a final judgment, which is at the end of history, where you will see your role in the midst of all of history, and you will see all the little stories and all the different narratives that the doc was talking about, this kind of narrative and the meaning of it and how God's hand guided all of it. So one of the things I look forward to one day is on that final judgment is the sense like all these beautiful, beautiful stories where a soldier's praying the rosary and doing sacrifices, or the little thing, or how this happened this way and this way. And God sees the whole picture there of how that unfolds. And you will see your tiny little part in that, the good and also the evil that we've done, and where we have not cooperated with Christ, and how God even uses that for his own glory and honor to bring out greater good out of that. So it's just something to kind of say, it's so far beyond our mind to get in that, but those little stories are worth listening to, and they're so beautiful. There's millions and millions and millions of them. It's fascinating.
Thank you for asking that. So the question was, when I teach high school students, what kind of questions do I get? So for instance, Churchill was one of the big ones that I would speak on. I've had some kids get up and leave because they object to Churchill for the way Churchill's been characterized nowadays.
as a war criminal, as as a bigot, as an imperialist, or whatever the case may be. I wrote an essay a while ago called something on the pastime of giant killing. That what history wants to do now is it wants to look at people who have fallibilities in their lives historically and to dismiss them altogether and just write them off. And the problem is, we all know as Catholics, we're like, well, that means everybody, except for Mary and Jesus. Everybody's condemned. And I think at the end of the day, we're all kind of trudging through, as Chesterton says, we're all in this boat together, and we owe each other a terrible loyalty. We're all trudging through this vale of tears together. And the issue is not what are the flaws of the person sitting next to me, and they may be mighty, or my flaws. The question is, what are the virtues that we can see in other people that we can take from that model and we could learn from it without excusing bad things? St. Basil once said, when the young Christians came up, Basil was from like the 3rd century or something like that, and the young Christian men said, should we read Plato? He's a pagan. Won't he kind of render us dirty in our thinking and so on? Will he corrupt us? And Basil says, you must be like the bumblebee and alight upon flower and take only the nectar you need and leave the rest behind. And the lesson I try to say about history is, you're not going to find any perfect person. I don't say this to Edina High School because they'd kick me out, but other than Christ and Mary, even though I'm thinking it. But we should alight upon those stories, flower to flower, and take the nectar we need, the inspiration we need, and leave the other stuff behind. And also recognize the cautionary tales that come from having foibles and flaws. So coming full circle to what you're asking, the kids that stay around and listen, they come up to me and they say, and this is not because of me, they say, I never hear history like this. And it's because it's a story. It's an incredible story. And history that gets reduced to just memorize these dates and spew out these minutiae, no wonder people don't like it. But we all tune in to great stories in film and great books written because we're swept up in the narrative. And is there a better narrative than this World War II? And the answer is yes, it's the Catholic narrative, right? But we all get caught up in the narrative. And so these kids will come up and say, where do I learn more? And I'll say, here's a biography, here's another book, and so on. But I say, remember, it's a story. And as Flannery O'Connor said, I tell a story because a statement would be inadequate. The story of history would be inadequate if it was a statement of history. And these kids, when I teach the medical students and give them glimpses of history, they reach out to me years later and they say, I'm reading this. I love that. It has nothing to do with medicine. It has to do with the human stories captured in history or literature. And if we can do that, if we can reinvigorate people's sense about the importance of human nature and the sweep of human beings, and then bring them where we can, the Catholic narrative, isn't that evangelizing at the end of the day? So anyway, if you love your kids and grandkids and you want to get them into history, email me. I'll give you books to send to them, right? But sell them on the notion of the dramatic sweep of the story of history, where you can take notes about how you could be better, be inspired by this, and maybe notes about how you shouldn't do this because that person did this thing, and you will grow as a result of it. I really believe that. I think these kids, they get awakened a little bit. So thank you for asking that.
Yes. And I'll put my Dr. Seuss ones up right next to his there, so, Yeah, Cat in the Hat's great. By the way, before the next question, just a word here in terms of pastoral stuff. The way the doctor is suggesting that we look at history as a story in terms of like the providential hand of God, and it's villains and foes, right? It's heroes and villains. It's actually a way I do my best by the grace of God is to, when I encounter every person, to say, there's a story here in front of me, a human being that's unique, who has their own particular sets of skills and history and family, and God has a vocation for them as well. And so instead of being judgy, put them in a little box, to step back, listen, try to understand, and learn from that whole of that person, Doesn't mean they agree everything with it, with how they think or act, but to understand kind of a broader context and to love them in that particular story. It's a fascinating way to meet people. Really is. Instead of like, well, I know you, and this is who you are, and this is how you look, and this. And that's more the cultural way of doing things. It's not a way of Christ, way that he encounters a human being and sees the kind of, from the beginning to the very end, and what he has in store for them as well. It's a fascinating way to be around people and to love people around you and the story and the unique person that they are. Was a question here? Yeah. Yeah.
I think I don't know all the nuances of it, but I think the notion was they wanted a city. They didn't want to do something like the capital. I mean, even though they firebombed Tokyo, I think it was accessibility of the city to the air flight pattern. I think it was the size of the city to make a point. And beyond, I think honestly beyond, I don't think there was a strategic role Hiroshima played in having munitions or certain leaders and so on and so forth. One other thing I want to say really briefly too, in my reading, and Father, you can maybe correct me, because it's been a while since I've read on it, but what's interesting is I've come across several sources that said the plan was always to drop 2. It was to drop 1 and 3 days later to drop a second. So that's an interesting thing, right? That also gets into the morality of this. And part of the reason was to say we have this, number 1 is we have a bomb. And number 2 is we have a lot of them. And if you think about it, and there was a conditional surrender, as Father had said, between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not unconditional. That was not satisfactory. But they would have had to step on the brakes if the unconditional surrender was coming after Hiroshima, because the wheels were already rolling to drop number 2.
Yeah. 3, of my understanding. We had the 1 we tested, and we had the 2. We didn't have anything after that, did we?
I think we were playing. I think there were some in development, but I think it was an absolute poker game to give the impression we had an arsenal. Very small number. I don't know. It might have been more than just 3 altogether with Alamogordo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. But we clearly did not have an arsenal. But we wanted to give the impression that we did.
It's not a bad point. A pristine city to see, okay, what are the effects? You have a clean city, and then let's just hit it. And then we could have, before and after to really get a sense of what's the devastating effect of this thing. Pat? Another heroic story there, right? Yeah, absolutely. Now, Nagasaki was the kind of epicenter for Catholicism in Japan. Kobe had a monastery there, and there's the martyrs and stuff. So that was kind of the epicenter for Catholicism in Japan at the time. A song for Nagasaki on the Hallow app. Okay. Mary. Oh yeah, Tibbetts. You can watch interviews on him, and he's very much. This is a great thing. Yeah, absolutely necessary. We're heroes. I mean, all the way to the end. Yeah. Very impersonal. Yep. Correct. Yep. And I think Tibbet said on the way back, I took a nap. Yeah, I just went to sleep. I needed some rest, so I actually let somebody else take over, and I took a nap.
It's a very good question. I'm not trying to let trade secrets out if there's any medical students in here, but that I teach or high school students, but teasing, but they're all at school. But what I have found is, this is a whole nother conversation because, but I'll give you this. I have found that history and literature, you can share a Catholic sensibility in the way you tell the story of history and literature without somebody recognizing it's a Catholic sensibility. And when I bring to my medical students, I have a 4-week rotation I'm doing right now. I meet with them once a week, and it's called The Wisdom of Literature in a Time of Plague. And we've been doing it for 5 years. I might have told you this before. The first week is on plague literature. It's like, how has plague been embodied in the literature since writing began, right? And I haven't watched films. Some are awful, terrible films, and others are frightening, okay? Because it's all reflective on COVID and the experience. But the next week is duty, the next week is suffering, and the next week is grace. And we read Albert Camus' The Plague, we read this pot boiler Andromeda strain from Michael Crichton. But then I have a bunch of excerpts each week for duty, for suffering, for grace, that draw from Jane Austen, from Dickens, from Dostoevsky, from Robert Frost, from Churchill. And all I'll say is, literature and history are vehicles for a Catholic sensibility in a way you would never even imagine. And these kids like it. They're a little bit caught on their heels a little bit because they're like, it sounds like a little bit of morality and so on, but all he's doing is talking about Pride and Prejudice or the Brothers Karamazov or a Churchill speech. And yet woven into that is the moral imagination. Woven into that is a Catholic sensibility of dignified, fallible, redeemable. And all I can say is these kids, whether it's medical students on a chalk talk on a Tuesday morning that I do, or this 4-week rotation for these kids, or high school kids at Edina, or an art of healing class at St. John's, they all like it. And it's not because of me. It's because someone's actually teaching them something that has a narrative rooted in story, but that pricks the morals that no one's talking to them about. No one. So that's why I would say if you read a Christmas Carol, I have a podcast right now interviewing an expert from Hillsdale on a Christmas Carol. What a moral story that is. And even though Dickens was Anglican, it's got a Catholic sensibility in it. Dignified, fallible, redeemable. And so I would just say, if you're wondering, how do I get through to these kids? Well, they may not take to Aquinas, okay? But they will take to Sense and Sensibility. They will take to a Robert Frost poem, the right poem at the right moment. They will take at one point or the other to Crime and Punishment because it's a story, it's a narrative. They will take to Churchill's summer speeches of 1940. And I'm just saying, in this day and age, we need to use every tool in the arsenal to bring people to God. And the moral imagination, the Catholic sensibility, comes through literature and history in ways that many of us forget, and we should use them. So, long answer to a short question.
Any last questions? We'll wrap up here. It's exciting. Yeah.
Two or three. So in the class I'll have 60 kids. And it happened more recently than it happened when I first started doing it. I don't. I think. I mean, they might have just had to go to the bathroom, for all I know. But I mean, that's. But let me tell you this. I'll be brief about this. Forgive me. I'll be really quick about this. So I was giving a series of lectures. I was giving an hour and a half lecture on medicine and literature for all the fourth year medical students. They would come back from all the rotations. They'd spend a week back here called on becoming or being a doctor. And I thought, why don't we give a talk on literature and medicine? And these are among classes like ultrasounds and suturing and pain management. It's weird, right? Who's gonna go to a medicine and literature class? Well, they really liked it because no one's talking about Dostoevsky and Austen and Dickens and those things and why it's relevant to the human condition you see every day. So it really got kind of popular, and then they said, we want everybody to take this. And I said, don't do that, please. But they did. So I had 180 kids over a series of talks, maybe, 60 per whatever. And I try to be very engaging, get kids in, all this kind of stuff. And there were, out of the reviews, I got the comments and the reviews. Out of the reviews of 180 kids, I had about 160, believe it or not, that were really, really nice. 10 were tepid, and 10 said this guy is patriarchy, dead white men, all this stuff, right? And the coordinator of the class reached out to me and said, what are we going to do to change the course because of these concerns? And I said, well, here's the thing. I said, first of all, a lot of these kids aren't necessarily learning Shakespeare anywhere. So if you believe in diversity, I'm giving them Shakespeare because that's also fitting into what they're not getting. And I said, and when you read the Brothers Karamazov and you were dealing with the strife between brothers Alyosha and Ivan Karamazov and the suffering they had, that was in Russia. Don't you think isn't the relevance of a 19th century Russian conundrum between brothers, is that suffering different than it is now? And she says, I've never read the Brothers Karamazov. And I thought to myself, of course you didn't. That's the problem, is that you haven't read it either, and you're telling me to change the course based on a couple people that had an ideological axe to grind and so on. And they never asked me to come back. So, and that's okay, because now I got a 4-week rotation. So the point is, look, I mean, we live in strange times. We have ideologies that want to kind of push and by the way, these guys are not really super controversial. And all I can say is, as you bring them the vehicle of literature and history, and you tell the moral narrative that comes out of it, and you tell an engaging story, the kids, they're a little bit off on their heels because they're not getting it at every school. Some schools they are. And then they sort of like it. But guess what? That's the camel's nose, to my way of thinking, it's the camel nose under the tent that leads them to God. Because if you at least have a fundamental notion of right and wrong and a moral imagination that's in the vehicle of history and literature, and you find your way ultimately to a feeling that there's more than just the ideology of the day, and you come to St. Therese and listen to Father Andrie, you're in. And so we just need to use whatever tool we have and whatever vehicle we have to bring people to God. And literature and history are two incredibly wonderful and vastly underutilized tools.
One last question over here. Was there a question? It's a great point. Yeah, no, without question. Based on the one presentation that we had, the Jewish question, right? We saw the kind of trajectory there towards the concentration camp, and that's certainly a lesson we could put of the kind of curtailing of certain basic civil rights and liberties that we have, without question. That's without question could have been in there. Before the final blessing, Mike, you have something else? Depends on what college you go to.
I have a daughter that just is now in freshman year of college, and they're teaching at her college. But I'll tell you what, it's way different than it once was. the canon is basically the canon of the greatest writers. As one great thinker once said, the best of what has been thought and said has been decimated. And it's concerning because at the end of the day, if you don't know what you don't know, how do you know what you're missing? And so that's why we were very deliberate about where we sent our kids to high school and very deliberate about what schools we really think that, I mean, our daughter Annabelle chose a lot of schools, but the bottom line is we wanted to go to a place that did not forget the notion of the lessons that will make you a complete person, and that is including great literature, great history, great theology, great philosophy. And, you know, St. John's almost eliminated their philosophy department. I mean, and fortunately, at the last minute, they kept it, but they were cutting things. It's like, you're a Benedictine university or a Benedictine college, and you can't lose philosophy and so on. So I'd say it all depends on the school, like Father said. It's out there, and by the way, there's a renaissance coming back because people are flocking to those places that are keeping those things alive. So the issue, I think, from a parent standpoint or grandparent standpoint is say, what culture is my kid going to or my grandkid going to, and how do they treat the truths of the era, literary, historical, theological, philosophical, because it's an incubator for that kid for 4 years, and to be somewhat kindly outspoken about what you believe in terms of going to the right place.
The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you for your time and the course and everything. So again, we have the spring course. Put your name tags in there if you wouldn't mind. And then we'll come up with the schedule for you for the fall for the Cold War, okay? All right. God's blessings.